There comes a moment in a connection like this where everything quietly begins to change. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that feels almost invisible at first. It's the moment when the chasing stops, when the pressure fades, when the need to be understood is no longer forced into the space between you. And strangely, that's exactly when they start to see you, not as someone trying to pull them closer, not as someone demanding more, but as someone who simply exists, steady, grounded, and safe. And this is the part no one really talks about, because it feels backwards. You were told that love needs effort, communication, consistency. You were told that if someone cares, they show it clearly, but here it doesn't work that way. Here, the more you try to define it, the more it slips through your fingers, and the more you let go, the more something deeper begins to form. Because what you're dealing with isn't a lack of feeling, it's a different way of protecting it. To understand this shift, you have to step into their inner world, not from a place of judgment, but from a place of awareness, because on the surface it can feel confusing, even painful. One moment they're close, warm, present, and the next they're distant, quiet, unreachable, and your mind tries to make sense of it. You wonder what you did wrong, what changed, why it feels like you're the only one holding on, but inside them, something entirely different is happening. There's a constant push and pull between wanting connection and fearing what that connection might take away. It's not that they don't feel, it's that feeling too much too quickly triggers something deep within them, something that tells them they might lose control, lose themselves, or get hurt in a way they don't know how to handle. So instead of leaning in, they step back. Not because you don't matter, but because it matters more than they're comfortable with. And this is where most people unknowingly push things further away, because when someone pulls back, the natural reaction is to move closer, to ask questions, to seek reassurance, to try and fix what feels like it's breaking. You want clarity, consistency, something solid to hold on to. But to them, that intensity doesn't feel like love. It feels like pressure. It feels like something closing in, something they can't fully meet without losing their sense of independence. So the more you reach, the more they retreat, not out of rejection, but out of self-protection. And the cycle continues over and over again until it feels exhausting, until it feels like no matter how much you give, it's never quite received the way you hoped it would be. At some point, though, something shifts inside you, not out of strategy, not as a game, but out of pure emotional fatigue. You begin to realize that forcing something to grow doesn't actually make it stronger. You start to see that constantly proving your worth doesn't make someone value you more. And slowly, you stop. You stop over-explaining, over-giving, overreaching. You step back into yourself. And in that space, something unexpected happens. The energy changes, the dynamic softens, and without even realizing it, you create the one thing they were missing all along, a sense of being seen without pressure. Because what being seen means to them is very different from what it means to you. It's not about deep emotional conversations or constant reassurance. It's about acceptance without expectation. It's about knowing they can exist as they are, without being pushed to open up before they're ready. It's about feeling like they're not being evaluated, analyzed, or slowly molded into something they're not. And when that pressure disappears, something inside them begins to relax. The walls they built don't come crashing down all at once, but they stop being reinforced. And that's where the real shift begins. You might not notice it immediately. In fact, it can be so subtle that you question if anything is changing at all. But then, small things start to appear. A message that feels a little more intentional, a moment of presence that lasts just a little longer, a softness in their tone that wasn't there before, and it catches you off guard because you didn't force it, you didn't ask for it, it just happened. And that's when you begin to understand something deeper, that their distance was never about a lack of care. It was about feeling overwhelmed by the weight of expectations they didn't know how to carry. This is also where one of the biggest misconceptions starts to dissolve. The belief that they simply don't care, that if they really wanted to, they would show up differently. But the truth is more complex than that, because caring for them doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like pulling away to process emotions they don't fully understand. And sometimes it looks like watching from a distance, trying to make sense of something that feels both safe and unfamiliar at the same time. Their emotional world isn't absent, it's just hidden behind layers of protection. And when you stop trying to break through those layers, when you stop trying to force them into vulnerability, you give them something rare. You give them the space to come forward on their own terms, and that's where curiosity begins to replace fear. Instead of feeling like they need to defend themselves, they start to observe. They start to notice how you're not reacting the way others have, how you're not demanding more, not chasing, not creating pressure, and that difference, it stays with them. It lingers in their thoughts in ways they can't easily dismiss. Because now, instead of associating connection with overwhelm, they begin to associate it with calm, with safety, with a sense of freedom rather than obligation. And that's when something inside them starts to open, even if just a little, not in a way that's obvious or immediate, but in a way that's real. And that's the key difference, because what's built without pressure doesn't come from fear, it comes from genuine willingness. So if you find yourself in this space, where things feel quieter, slower, less defined, don't mistake that for nothing. Don't assume that just because it's not loud, it's not meaningful. Because sometimes the most powerful changes happen in silence, in the absence of force, in the presence of something that feels safe enough to grow naturally. And this is where their behavior starts to change, not because they were told to, not because they were pushed to, but because for the first time they don't feel like they have to run anymore. And once that shift begins, once they no longer feel like they have to run, something deeper starts forming beneath the surface. It's not loud, it's not immediate, and it's definitely not predictable, but it's real. Because what you've unknowingly created is something they rarely experience: emotional safety, not the kind that comes from words or promises, but the kind that comes from energy, the kind that says, you don't have to perform here, you don't have to prove anything, you can just be. And for someone who has spent most of their life associating connection with pressure, expectation, or loss of control, that feeling is disarming in the most unexpected way. It softens them, it quiets the part of them that's always scanning for danger. And for the first time, being close to someone doesn't feel like something they need to escape from. Because safety for them is everything. Without it, no amount of love, effort, or consistency will ever reach them fully. You could give your best, your deepest, your most genuine self, and it still wouldn't land the way you hoped, because their system is wired to protect, not to receive. But when safety is present, when there's no pressure attached to your presence, something inside them begins to recalibrate. Their guard doesn't drop all at once, but it loosens. Their thoughts slow down, and instead of preparing to pull away, they start to stay just a little longer than before. And that little longer is where everything begins to change. What's even more surprising is how powerful silence becomes in this phase. Not silence as in absence or neglect, but silence as in space, room to breathe, room to think, room to feel without interruption. Because when you're constantly present, constantly reaching, constantly trying to keep the connection alive, they don't get the chance to process what they actually feel. It becomes noise. But when that noise fades, when your energy becomes steady instead of chasing, your presence lingers in a completely different way. It's no longer something they react to, it's something they reflect on. And this is where the shift from defense to curiosity begins. Before, their focus was on protecting themselves, creating distance, maintaining control, avoiding anything that felt too intense. But now, with the pressure gone, there's nothing to defend against. And in that absence of threat, curiosity quietly takes its place. They start to wonder, they start to notice, they start to ask themselves questions they weren't asking before. Why does this feel different? Why am I thinking about this more than I expected? Why does their absence feel noticeable? And this curiosity is powerful because it comes from within them. It's not something you triggered through effort or persuasion. It's something that grew naturally in the space you allowed. And when curiosity is present, they begin to lean in, not fully, not all at once, but in small, almost unnoticeable ways. They might linger in conversations a bit longer. They might respond with more thought, more intention. They might even start sharing small pieces of themselves, things they wouldn't normally reveal. And if you're not paying attention, you might miss it, because it doesn't look like a dramatic transformation. It looks like subtle consistency. These subtle signs are easy to overlook, especially if you're used to intensity. But in this kind of dynamic, subtlety is everything, a message that feels warmer, a response that comes without delay, a question about your life that shows genuine interest. These aren't random, they're indicators. Indicators that something inside them is shifting, that the walls are no longer as rigid as they once were. And the key here is not to rush it, not to suddenly increase your expectations or try to accelerate the process, because the moment pressure re-enters, even in the smallest way, their instinct to pull back can return just as quickly. What's happening during this time goes deeper than behavior. It's internal, because now you're not just someone they interact with, you're someone they think about, and not in a fleeting, surface-level way, but in a way that lingers. They replay conversations. They notice how you made them feel. They compare this experience to others they've had before and realize something doesn't match. Because before, connection felt heavy, complicated, overwhelming, but here it feels light, calm, almost effortless. And that contrast stays with them. This is why they start thinking about you more, even when you're not around. Not because you're constantly in their face, but because you're not. Because your absence isn't filled with pressure or expectation, it's filled with a quiet sense of presence that they can't quite explain. And that presence becomes something they return to, mentally, emotionally. It becomes familiar in a way that feels safe. And for someone who values independence above almost everything, feeling safe with someone else is a shift they don't take lightly. But even as this connection grows, there's still an internal conflict happening inside them. Because part of them wants to move closer, to explore this feeling, to understand it, to experience more of it. But another part of them is still cautious, still aware of what closeness has meant in the past. There's a tension between desire and fear, between curiosity and control, and this tension is what makes their behavior seem inconsistent at times. One moment they lean in, the next they pause. One moment they're present, the next they pull back slightly. Not as a rejection, but as a way to regulate what they're feeling. And understanding this conflict changes everything, because instead of taking their pauses personally, you begin to see them for what they are, part of their process, part of how they learn to feel without becoming overwhelmed. And when you don't react to those moments with pressure or fear, you reinforce the very thing that's allowing them to open up in the first place: safety. Eventually, this internal shift reaches a point where it starts to show more clearly, and one of the biggest signs is when they begin to reach out first. It might not happen in a dramatic or obvious way. It could be something simple, a message, a question, a small check-in. But what makes it significant isn't what they say, it's the fact that they initiated it. Because for someone who is used to keeping distance, choosing to move closer is not a small step. It's intentional. It's meaningful, and it reflects something deeper than just casual interest. And when that happens, it's important to understand what it really means. It doesn't mean they've completely changed. It doesn't mean all their fears have disappeared. But it does mean that something inside them is shifting enough to take that step, enough to move toward you instead of away. And that is where real change begins. Not in forced conversations or emotional demands, but in the quiet, voluntary actions that come from a place of genuine willingness. So as you move through this phase, the most important thing you can do is stay grounded in yourself, not in their behavior, not in trying to interpret every small shift, but in your own stability. Because the more steady you are, the safer the space becomes, and the safer the space becomes, the more they continue to open naturally at their own pace. And that's the paradox of it all. The moment you stop trying to make them change is the moment they start changing on their own. And as this quiet transformation continues, something even deeper begins to unfold inside them. Because now, it's no longer just curiosity or subtle openness. It becomes an internal experience they can't easily ignore. They start to feel the connection in a way that doesn't overwhelm them, but also doesn't leave them untouched. And this is where the real emotional conflict begins to rise to the surface. Because for the first time, they're not just aware of you, they're affected by you. Your presence, your absence, your energy, it all starts to matter in ways they didn't anticipate. And that realization can feel both comforting and unsettling at the same time. There's a part of them that wants to lean into it, to explore what this connection could become when it's not built on pressure or expectation. But at the same time, there's another part that hesitates, that questions whether getting closer means risking something they've spent so long protecting. This is the internal tension they live with, the pull toward connection and the instinct to maintain control. It's not a simple back and forth, it's layered, emotional, and deeply rooted in how they've learned to relate to closeness. And when you begin to recognize this, their behavior starts to make more sense. The moments where they seem closer than ever, followed by moments where they slightly retreat, not disappear, not completely shut down, but just enough to create space again. And if you're not aware of what's happening beneath the surface, it can feel confusing. It can feel like mixed signals, like inconsistency, like uncertainty, but it's not confusion on their end. It's processing. It's them learning how to hold connection without feeling consumed by it. And that process takes time, it takes space, and most importantly, it takes someone who doesn't react to their pauses as rejection. Because the moment those pauses are met with pressure again, the entire dynamic can shift backward. And this is where one of the most important turning points happens, the moment they begin to reach out first, not because they feel obligated, not because they're responding to your energy, but because something inside them wants to, and that desire, it's new for them. When they initiate, even in the smallest way, it's not just an action, it's a reflection of internal movement. It's them stepping outside of their usual patterns, choosing connection instead of distance, even if just for a moment. And those moments matter more than they seem, because for someone who is used to controlling how close people get, choosing to close that distance themselves is significant. It might show up in simple ways. A message when you weren't expecting it, a question that feels more personal than usual, a moment where they stay engaged instead of pulling away. And it might not seem like much on the surface, but beneath it, there's intention, there's awareness, there's a quiet willingness that wasn't there before. And this is where many people unknowingly disrupt the progress, because when they finally start moving closer, it's tempting to meet that energy with intensity, to finally express everything you've been holding back, to ask for clarity, to try and define where things are going. It feels natural, almost deserved after everything you've been through. But this is also where the balance becomes crucial, because what brought them closer was the absence of pressure. And reintroducing it too quickly, even with good intentions, can trigger that same instinct to pull away again, not because they don't care, but because the dynamic starts to feel familiar in a way that once overwhelmed them. And that's why patience in this phase isn't just important, it's essential. At the same time, something else begins to shift in how they see you, because now you're no longer someone who feels emotionally demanding or unpredictable. You become something much more rare, someone who feels steady, someone who doesn't need to chase, doesn't need to control, doesn't need to force outcomes. And that kind of energy, it's magnetic in a way that doesn't rely on effort. Your detachment, your ability to remain grounded in yourself, starts to stand out to them, not as distance, but as strength. Because it shows them that your sense of self isn't dependent on their behavior, that your presence comes from choice, not need. And for someone who values independence so deeply, that's something they respect, even if they don't say it out loud. And this is where attraction begins to deepen in a different way. Not the kind that's driven by intensity or emotional highs and lows, but the kind that's built on stability, on trust, on a sense of ease that doesn't feel forced. And the more they experience that with you, the more they start to associate you with something safe, something they don't have to protect themselves from. At the same time, your own sense of self-worth begins to play a powerful role in this dynamic, because when you stop overgiving, when you stop trying to earn their attention or prove your value, the entire energy shifts. You're no longer placing them in a position of control, you're standing beside them as an equal. And that shift is something they feel even if they can't fully explain it. Because now, your presence carries a different weight. It's not heavy or demanding, it's grounded, calm, self-assured. And that naturally creates a sense of respect. It makes them see you differently, not just as someone who cares, but as someone who values themselves enough not to chase. And ironically, that's when they start to value you more. Because when something isn't constantly available, constantly giving, constantly trying, it creates space for appreciation to grow. It allows them to recognize what you bring into their life without it being overshadowed by pressure. And that recognition becomes something they hold on to. But even in this phase of growth, there's still one mistake that can undo everything if it's not understood. And it's a subtle one, because it often comes from a place of excitement, hope, or even relief. It's the moment where you feel like things are finally moving forward, and you try to secure it. You might start expecting more consistency, more clarity, more emotional openness. You might begin to lean in more, thinking the foundation is now strong enough to handle it. But for them, this sudden shift can feel like a return to pressure. Like the space they once had is slowly being replaced with expectation again. And even if that expectation is reasonable, even if it's coming from a genuine place, it can still trigger their instinct to pull back. Because the truth is, they're still in the process of changing. They're still learning how to navigate closeness without losing themselves, and rushing that process even unintentionally can make them feel like they're being pushed into something they're not fully ready to hold yet. So the key in this phase isn't to move faster. It's to stay consistent, to allow what's building to continue growing naturally without trying to define it too quickly. Because what's forming here isn't based on pressure, it's based on trust. And trust doesn't develop through intensity, it develops through stability. And when you can hold that stability, when you can remain grounded in your own energy without needing to control the outcome, you create the one thing that allows this connection to continue evolving: space without distance, closeness without pressure, and a dynamic where change happens not because it's forced, but because it's finally safe enough to. And as everything continues to unfold in this quieter, more grounded way, there's one thing that becomes more important than anything else. Not what they're doing, not how fast things are progressing, not even where it's all leading, but how you hold yourself through it. Because at this stage, the connection is no longer being shaped by chasing or distance. It's being shaped by stability. And that stability begins with you. It becomes about staying rooted in your own life, your own energy, your own sense of self, regardless of what they do next. Because the moment your focus shifts entirely onto their behavior, the balance starts to tilt again. You begin to overanalyze, to read into every message, every pause, every small change, and without realizing it, you slowly drift back into the same energy that once created pressure, not outwardly, not in obvious ways, but internally. And that internal shift is something they can feel. But when you remain grounded, when your life continues to move forward, when your sense of fulfillment doesn't depend on their presence, something powerful happens. You become consistent in a way that feels safe, not predictable in a boring sense, but steady in a way that allows them to trust the connection without fearing sudden emotional demands. And that steadiness, it gives them the space to keep opening without feeling like they have to rush. Because real change, especially for someone who has spent so long protecting themselves, doesn't happen overnight. It's not a switch that flips, it's a pattern that slowly rewires. Every moment of safety, every interaction that doesn't carry pressure, every experience where they don't feel overwhelmed, it all adds up. It builds something new inside them, something they haven't fully experienced before. And there will be moments where it feels slow, Moments where you question whether anything is actually happening beneath the surface, because the changes aren't always visible right away. They don't always show up in big gestures or clear declarations. Sometimes they show up in consistency, in the way they don't disappear like they used to, in the way conversations feel a little easier, a little more natural, in the way they begin to stay present instead of pulling away. And this is where patience becomes more than just waiting. It becomes understanding. Understanding that what's being built here isn't fragile. It's just unfolding at a pace that allows it to last. Because anything rushed, anything forced, anything built on pressure might feel intense in the moment, but it rarely holds. What you're creating now is different. It's steady, it's grounded, and most importantly, it's real. Then, almost unexpectedly, something shifts again. But this time, it's more visible, more tangible, because this is the moment where they begin to let you in, not completely, not all at once, but in ways that matter. They start sharing pieces of themselves that they usually keep hidden, thoughts, feelings, small vulnerabilities, things they wouldn't have felt safe expressing before. And it might not come out in perfectly structured conversations. It might be subtle, even slightly awkward at times. But that's what makes it real, because it's not rehearsed, it's genuine. And when this happens, it's important to recognize it for what it is, not just communication, but trust. Because for someone who has spent so much time guarding their inner world, allowing someone else to see even a part of it is a significant step. It means they're no longer just experiencing the connection from a distance, they're stepping into it. And the way you respond in these moments matters more than anything. Not with intensity, not with overwhelming emotion, not with expectations, but with calm presence, with acceptance, with the same energy that made them feel safe enough to open up in the first place. Because this is where the foundation solidifies, not through grand gestures, but through consistency in how you hold space for them. As this continues, the connection begins to take on a different shape. It's no longer one-sided, no longer driven by imbalance or uncertainty. It starts to feel mutual, balanced, like both of you are contributing in your own ways at your own pace. And that balance, it changes everything. Because now, it's not about trying to win them or make them choose you. It's not about proving your worth or holding on to something that feels unstable. It becomes about sharing something that feels natural, something that doesn't require constant effort to maintain, because it's built on understanding rather than pressure. And this is where one of the most important realizations comes in, that this transformation, it was never about changing them. It was about changing the dynamic, about removing the pressure that kept them in a state of defense, about creating a space where they could choose connection instead of feeling forced into it. Because when someone feels like they have a choice, their actions become genuine. They show up because they want to, not because they feel obligated. And that difference is everything. It's the difference between something that feels temporary and something that has the potential to grow. And as you step back and look at everything that's unfolded, you begin to see it clearly. The distance, the confusion, the mixed signals, they were never random. They were part of a pattern that was rooted in protection. And the shift didn't happen because you pushed harder. It happened because you let go of the need to. And that final realization, it changes the way you see everything. Because when an avoidant finally feels seen without pressure, something inside them softens in a way they can't fake. They stop running, not because they're forced to stay, but because they no longer feel the need to escape. They begin to move closer, not in a way that feels overwhelming, but in a way that feels natural, intentional, real. And maybe the most powerful part of all of this is that it didn't happen through control. It didn't happen through strategy. It didn't happen through trying to become someone else or do everything perfectly. It happened because you created space. Space for them to breathe, space for them to feel, space for them to choose. And in that space, something real was finally able to grow. Not rushed, not forced, but built in a way that allows it to last. And that's the moment everything truly changes, because now, they're not just in your life. They're choosing to be there.